the whole global financial crisis is somehow the fault of the Liberal Party. I got to say to you, every now and then someone makes a claim in politics that takes your breath away. And boy, this was one of them.
So, what about the very notion that extreme capitalism was to blame for the global financial crisis? Do you reject that?
Look, I don't know what he means by all of this epochal. I think he said it was an epochal changing event. You tell me what that means. I'll say this. I think the US regulatory system was deficient. The US regulatory system had the Federal Reserve regulating banks, essentially nobody regulating mortgage originators. They didn't have proper insurance regulators. In the US, they have 50 insurance regulators, one for each state. And they had nobody looking at the overall prudential control of the system. Now, we recognised that was an error in 1997. And in 1997, I established a body called the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, APRA. And we took prudential regulation away from the Reserve Bank. By the way, the Reserve Bank strongly resisted that. I think today they would say it was the right decision. We put it in APRA. We said, we don't care what you call your institution. You can call it a bank, you can call it a building society, you can call it a credit union. We are going to have a regulator which will have prudential controls across the board on all of those financial institutions. When the US started going into subprime mortgage in a big way, and it's all on the record, I called in the Australian banks, all of the chief executives. I said, we don't want to go down this road. We don't want to have huge exposure to subprime lending. In Australia, it used to be called low doc lending, you might recall. And so we kept our financial institutions out of all of that kind of lending. Now, the Australian banks, which prior to that would have been considered minnows in world terms, are now, because of all of the failures in the US, are now amongst the 20 top banks in the world, and they're all AA rated. In fact, Julia Gillard boasting about the situation. So, yes, the United States, by comparison to Australia, had a poor regulatory system, and that's been proven. But in Australia, we had a system that was totally different. By the way, one that we were continually recommending to the Americans. I recommended it to the Federal Reserve, the US Treasury. We were holding it up at APEC meetings. And I hope that there are countries around the world that adopt it. But, let's not say there's been a failure here in Australia. This essay, by the way, I know it's good for the Monthly, and I know it's going to boost their sales, but, this has got to be one of the weakest essays that you've seen in a very long time, and it ought to be condemned.
Well, Mr. Rudd is essentially arguing that with extreme capitalism and neoliberalism getting the world into this terrible position, social democracy is now... it now falls to social democracy, as he said, to prevent neoliberalism, neo-capitalism from cannibalising itself. So I know that some people have regarded this essay as a call for return to big government. Is that how you see it?
Oh yes, that's the only way you can see it. By the way, when Rudd says this has failed for 30 years, he's not only condemning me and the coalition government, he's condemning Hawke Keating, presumably, because they were part of the last 30 years. He's presumably condemning Fraser. If you want to go back 30 years, and he says the last 30 years have been a failure, who do you end up with? Go back 30 years. Surprise. Oh, it's Gough Whitlam. It's Gough Whitlam. Now, Mr. Rudd says social democracy has got to rescue capitalism from itself. And I suppose we're lucky that the world has Kevin Rudd to rescue the world capitalist system. And maybe after he's rescued the world capitalist system, he could move on to solving the Middle East, other things which undoubtedly he will. But let me ask a serious question. If social democracy is required to rescue the world, which social democratic country does he hold up as his model? Because Britain's been under a Labor government for over a decade. Britain has a huge budget deficit. The British would see themselves as a social democratic government. I don't think the British record's that good. By the way, I don't think the American record's that good.
Well, it appears he may well be
think,
pinning his hopes on Barack Obama, perhaps advised by the Australian government.
Well, I think that the Australian model has something that could be held up and recommended around the world. The model that we have with APRA, I agree with that. But this idea that social democracy is the answer. I mean, let's forget about what might happen in the future. We did have a social democratic government in Britain through all this period. Is Britain a great success? Northern Rock, Royal Bank of Scotland, budget deficit of 8%. I mean, is Britain the answer? You know, actually, we ought to be much more assertive here. We're Australian. I think the Australian model is what can be held up around the world. So why doesn't Kevin Rudd want to say that? Because there's a certain ideological fervour to him. He can't say the Australian model's the answer because he wasn't part of putting it in place. That would be to give too much credit to the coalition government. Now, I think at a time like this, he ought to drop his pride. He ought to say, as Julia Gillard, in all fairness, Julia Gillard had the honesty to say, yes, the Australian model was the best, and he shouldn't be ashamed of actually giving credit to the Liberal Party rather than writing these appalling essays for the Independent Monthly.
Peter Costello, we're out of time. We thank you very much once again for coming in to talk to us tonight on Lateline. I'm sure those words will resonate in your side of politics and perhaps on the other side. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tony.